Kaka and I continued our desperate escape from the Goblin breeding farm, while the storm swallowed the forest around us. Rain fell with such force that it blurred the trees, flattened the undergrowth, and turned every patch of earth into sucking mud. Under any other circumstances, the weather would have been another enemy. That morning, it was also the only reason we were still alive. The downpour washed blood and sweat from our skin, scattering the scent that would have guided the forest's predators directly to us. Even with the rain hiding our trail, every step remained a struggle. My body was bruised, exhausted, and caked with mud. Kaka was in far worse condition. An adventurer's shield had crushed the side of his head, leaving his face swollen and distorted. Blood seeped from the wound beneath layers of dirt, and his hunched body trembled with every movement. His legs barely obeyed him, yet he continued forward through sheer will. He was no longer thinking clearly. The loss of blood, pain, and damage to his skull had pushed him into a haze, where the present mixed with memories of the hatchlings he had failed to save. Although I was the only one still beside him, Kaka moved as if he were guiding all of them through the storm. Between ragged breaths, he kept whispering the same warning. We needed shelter before dawn fully broke, before the rain eased, and before the monsters began hunting again. His broken phrases were almost lost beneath the wind. Shelter before the monsters stir. He rasped. Must protect the hatchlings. Safety in darkness. Keep moving. No rest until we hide. The words were confused, but their meaning was clear. The storm had brought us time, not safety. We forced our way deeper beneath the heavy canopy. I pulled a broad leaf over my head in a useless attempt to shield myself. But one glance at Kaka made my own discomfort feel insignificant. His body swayed violently. His eyes, once lively despite all he had endured, had become dull and unfocused. Each step seemed ready to be his last, yet he refused to stop. Hours later, when both of us were close to collapse, Kaka raised a shaking finger and pointed beneath the roots of a giant apple tree. "Shelter," he whispered. "We go there. Safe for little ones." A narrow hole opened between the gnarled roots. It was barely large enough for our small bodies, but it led into a shallow underground chamber protected by packed soil and old wood. The walls had been worn smooth by time and rainwater. Moss covered much of the floor, and the curved roots formed a low ceiling over us. The air smelled of damp earth, fallen leaves, and decaying fruit. It was cramped and dark, but it was hidden. The moment we crawled inside, Kaka's strength disappeared. He collapsed onto the moss, his limbs folding beneath him. For a few seconds, I thought he had simply fallen unconscious. Then he began reaching for the pebbles scattered across the ground. His fingers closed around them with extraordinary care. In his damaged mind, the stones had become the hatchlings we had lost. He gathered each one, cradling the smooth shapes in his palms while whispering names and murmuring apologies. He described their tiny ears, their soft skin, and the happy noises they had once made when they crowded around him. Tears ran down his ruined face. "My little ones, I'm sorry," Kaka said. "I couldn't protect you. I couldn't keep you safe." With the pebbles still pressed against his chest, he finally fainted. For several breaths, I remained frozen beside him. The stones slipped from his fingers and scattered across the moss, yet his hands stayed curved, as if he were still holding tiny bodies. I gathered the pebbles and placed them close to his chest, unable to decide whether preserving the illusion was an act of kindness or cruelty. The hatchlings had depended on Kaka for everything. At the breeding farm, he had fed them when food was available, hidden them when violent goblins passed nearby, and comforted them after punishments. He had never possessed the power to defeat our masters, but he had given the little ones whatever protection his own body could provide. Losing them was not merely another wound. It had shattered the reason he continued living. Even while injured beyond recognition, he had tried to lead them to shelter. His damaged mind refused to accept that only I remained. I pressed my forehead against his arm and promised that his effort had not been meaningless. He had saved at least one hatchling. I was still alive because he had carried me through terror, rain, and pain long after a weaker will would have surrendered. That promise gave me the strength to stop crying and begin thinking. If Kaka died, grief would not be the only thing I lost. I would lose the only person who knew this world, the only person who had shown me love and the only reason I had to believe goblins could be more than the monsters who ruled the farm. I could not allow that to happen while any possibility remained. I rushed to him and shook his shoulder, pleading for him to open his eyes. His body remained limp. Each breath came as a shallow, wheezing gasp, followed by a pause long enough to make me fear the next one would never arrive. "Don't fall into the endless sleep, Kaka," I begged. "You can't leave me. I need you. Please wake up." He did not respond. I forced myself to examine him instead of surrendering to panic. The wound on his head was worse than anything I had imagined. The bones had shifted out of position, and the torn skin could not close over them. If I did nothing, he would die from blood loss, infection, or the injury itself. The cave contained no bandages, medicine, or proper tools. What it did contain was an old spiderweb tucked into one corner. A dried giant spider remained trapped beside it, long dead and brittle. Its silk was still strong, and its fangs were thin and sharp, a fragment of knowledge from my former life. As Shota surfaced through the fog in my mind, spider silk could be used as thread. A narrow fang could serve as a crude needle. It was not enough to make the procedure safe, but safety was no longer an option. I tied a strand of silk around one fang and positioned myself behind Kaka's head. Before I could close the wound, I had to force the displaced bones back toward their proper alignment. My body was tiny, and Kaka, though thin, was still much heavier than me. I braced my feet against the back of his skull, gripped his upper jaw, and pulled with everything I had. My arms shook, my joints protested. For a terrifying moment, nothing moved. Then the fractured shape shifted beneath my hands with a wet crunch. The separated edges drew closer, and his head regained something resembling its original form. There was no time to hesitate. I pushed the spider fang through the torn scalp and drew the silk after it. Each stitch was crooked and uneven. My hands slipped repeatedly because of the blood, yet I continued until the last part of the wound was closed. When I tied the final knot, my muscles gave out, and I collapsed beside him. Kaka was still breathing. That small fact became the only victory I allowed myself. I pressed my fingers against his chest and searched for a heartbeat. The pulse was faint, but present. His body, however, had grown cold, and his breaths weakened with every passing minute. Closing the wound had not restored the blood he had lost or eased the trauma throughout his body. I remembered that certain forest herbs could reduce pain and swelling. Kaka had once shown them to us at the farm, though at the time I had paid little attention. Now I searched my memory for the shape of their leaves and the sharp scent released when they were crushed. Ignoring the exhaustion in my limbs, I crawled back into the storm. Rain struck my skin like countless small blows. I searched the ground beneath shrubs and around exposed roots until I found several plants that matched what I remembered. I gathered as many as my hands could carry and hurried back to the cave. There, I crushed the leaves and stems against a flat stone until they became a thick paste. I spread the mixture across Kaka's injuries, working carefully around the stitches. The smell filled the chamber, bitter and medicinal. After several minutes, his strained gasps began to soften. His breathing remained weak, but it was less erratic. My relief lasted only a moment. Kaka was pale, emaciated, and nearly empty of strength. Goblin bodies could recover from injuries that would kill many other creatures, but regeneration demanded fuel. Without food and water, his body would have nothing from which to rebuild itself. I left the cave again, this time carrying a broad leaf over my head as a makeshift umbrella. Not far from the apple tree, I found a bush covered in large red berries. I shook the branches until the fruit fell, piled the berries onto the leaf, and dragged the load back through the mud. Kaka could not eat on his own. When I crushed the berries into his mouth, the pulp simply collected there. He was too weak even to swallow. I lifted his head, opened his jaw, and tried giving him smaller amounts. But nothing moved down his throat. There was no one else to help, and waiting would only let him weaken further. With tears running down my face, I used my tiny hand to push the crushed fruit past his tongue and into his throat. His body barely reacted. A faint gagging movement tightened around my fingers, then vanished. The weakness of that reflex frightened me more than his injuries. I continued slowly, stopping whenever his breathing changed. Berry juice, saliva, and mud covered both of us. At last, enough food reached his stomach to leave his belly swollen. The sight was disturbing, but it meant his body now had something to consume. I cradled his head and whispered into his ear, "Stay with me, Kaka. You protected me. Now let me protect you." Several hours later, I repeated the process with more berries and small sips of water. The second feeding was no easier than the first. Kaka's jaw had stiffened, and I had to massage the muscles before I could open his mouth. I crushed the berries into a smoother pulp, mixed them with a little water, and gave him only what I believed he could manage. Whenever his throat moved, even slightly, I paused and watched his chest. His eyes fluttered once, but no awareness appeared behind them. A faint sound escaped his mouth, too weak to become a word. I answered anyway, telling him that we had found shelter and that the storm could no longer reach us. I described the moss, the roots, and the little pool of water as though he were awake and listening. Talking helped me maintain control. Without my own voice, the cave filled with the sound of his breathing, and every irregular pause felt like death approaching. By the time I finished, my hands were sticky with berry pulp and my body shook from hunger. I had given most of the food to Kaka. A part of me knew I needed strength as well, but the thought of eating while he lay near death filled me with guilt. Only after forcing the last small portion down his throat did I swallow a few crushed berries myself. I wiped his mouth, lifted his head onto a fold of moss, and checked the stitches again. The spider silk held, though swollen skin pressed tightly against it. I placed fresh herbs around the wound and used the cleanest moss to absorb the blood, still seeping from smaller injuries. The work seemed endless. Every problem led to another. Closing his scalp did not replace blood. Feeding him did not guarantee he could digest the food. Herbs could ease pain, but they could not protect him from cold. I was trying to rebuild a life with materials found on a cave floor, and I had no certainty that any of it would succeed. Still, each breath told me to continue. Each feeding demanded patience, because too much at once might choke him. When I finished, his throat was no longer completely dry, and his breathing remained steady enough to give me hope. Only then did I think about warmth. The cave protected us from the wind, but the damp air still carried a biting chill. I tried to stand so I could search for large leaves to cover him. The chamber tilted around me. A wave of dizziness erased my balance. I staggered once, fell face first into the dirt, and reached toward the entrance with an arm that no longer had the strength to move. My vision narrowed. Somewhere beyond the darkness, a familiar woman laughed. Then, everything vanished. A flash of blinding light tore open the blackness. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer beneath the apple tree. I knelt in an enormous empty chamber, surrounded by oppressive darkness. At its center stood a throne wrapped in black fire. The flames gave off an unnatural glow, illuminating the figure seated above me, while leaving the rest of the room hidden. Luceria, the goddess of lust, watched me from the throne with the confidence of someone who considered mortal lives no more significant than insects. Her beauty was overwhelming, but there was nothing comforting in it. Every smile carried mockery, and every movement reminded me that I had no power in her presence. "Well, well," she said, "Hermit has returned yet again. Or perhaps I should call you Shota." "No, you have lost nearly all memory of that name, so Hermit will do." I stared at her, unable to understand how I had arrived there. Luceria answered the question before I could speak. "You died again," she explained, almost cheerfully. "You lasted longer this time. Almost long enough to be praiseworthy. Almost." She leaned back against the throne and considered me with open amusement. "Now I must decide whether to raise you once more or extinguish your worthless soul and spare the world from your existence." Terror drove me to my knees. I begged her to show mercy, insisting that I was only a young goblin who had done nothing except care for those around me. I told her I had not lived long enough to deserve such punishment, and that I was not like the cruel goblins who had ruled the breeding farm. "Please, great goddess," I pleaded. "I have tried to be kind. What crime have I committed in this life?" Her laughter echoed across the chamber. "Little fool, I was not speaking of your present body. I was speaking of the useless human you once were, a mortal named Shota." The name released broken images inside my mind. A room, a glowing screen, a life spent avoiding the world beyond the walls. More fragments followed. Endless hours spent playing games in his mother's apartment, withdrawing from responsibility, blaming the world, and allowing one day after another to disappear. The memories lacked detail, but the shape of that life was unmistakable. Luceria watched recognition spread across my face and took pleasure in it. She accused Shota of believing himself a victim while refusing every chance to change. Whenever the world disappointed him, he retreated farther into isolation. Whenever someone asked him to act, he found another excuse. He contributed nothing to the people supporting him and still resented them for failing to make him happy. Her words hurt because they aligned with the flashes inside my mind. I remembered resentment without purpose, fantasies of receiving power without earning it, and a habit of escaping into imagined worlds whenever reality demanded effort. Yet I also understood that the memories belonged to a life already lost. The goblin kneeling before her had crawled through mud, stitched another creature's skull, searched for medicine in a storm, and surrendered his own food. None of those actions erased Shota's failures, but they proved I was capable of choosing differently. I tried to explain this distinction. I did not demand that she forgive the human I had been. I asked only for the chance to finish what I had begun. Perhaps Shota was worthless, I said. Perhaps he wasted everything. But Kaka is alive because I acted. Let me return so that action is not wasted too. Luceria's expression did not soften. She said desperation could make even cowards move when their own comfort depended on it. I insisted that my comfort had nothing to do with the plea. Returning meant pain, hunger, and likely death. I wanted it because Kaka would otherwise suffer alone. For a moment, the goddess studied me in silence. The black flames moved behind her, without smoke or heat, and the empty chamber seemed to wait for her judgment. Then she dismissed the distinction. To her, attachment to one goblin did not amount to redemption. If anything, it gave her another way to make my life painful. That was when I realized my plea had succeeded for the cruelest possible reason. Luceria described that former existence with disgust. Shota had been a shut-in who wasted his days playing games in his mother's apartment. He blamed other people for his failures, complained about his circumstances, and never made a serious effort to change them. In her judgment, even an insect contributed more to the world than he ever had. She reminded me that she had once offered him a chance to begin again, in a world filled with fantastic abilities. Instead of accepting the opportunity with gratitude, Shota had angered her. Becoming a powerless goblin slave had been the punishment she chose. That is why you crawl through filth now, Luceria said. You are a shadow of the human you were, condemned to suffering because you squandered every chance placed before you. I could not remember enough of Shota's life to argue. Perhaps everything she said was true. Still, the creature kneeling before her was no longer concerned with games, pride, or comfort. All I could think about was Kaka lying alone in the cave. I admitted that I had made mistakes in my former life, but insisted I was no longer the same person. I had learned to care for someone besides myself. I was willing to endure any punishment if she would return me to the living world. Kaka needs me, I told her. He is wounded and unconscious. He protected me when no one else would. I cannot abandon him now. Kaka was more than my caretaker. He had become my Dada and Muma, the only family I possessed in that cruel world. He had dragged his shattered body through the storm to keep me alive. If I remained dead, he would be left without food, medicine, or anyone to guard him. Luceria listened without sympathy. How beautifully you grovel, she said. But redemption is reserved for those who deserve it, and you do not. One act of attachment cannot erase the worthless human life you lived. I continued begging. I promised to accept pain, hunger, fear, or anything else waiting below if she would allow me to return long enough to save him. The goddess finally smiled. Very well, I will give you a kind of salvation, though not the one you desire. I will breathe a little life into your broken body and send you back to continue your journey. Destroying your soul would be mercy, and mercy is something you have not earned. Before I could answer, Luceria snapped her fingers. The throne, the black flames, and the chamber disappeared. I woke sprawled across the moss, while rain drummed against the roots above me. Pain ran through every part of my body, but the first emotion I felt was relief. I was alive. And the cave had not changed during my absence. Memories of Laceria began fading almost immediately. Her throne and voice slipped away like fragments of a nightmare after waking. What remained was urgency. Kaka still lay where I had left him, breathing weakly beneath the dim light filtering through the entrance. My own stomach cramped from hunger, and my limbs felt as though they might fail again at any moment. If I collapsed without eating, neither of us would survive. I crawled outside and returned to the berry bush, letting the rain strike my bare skin while I pulled several fruits from the lowest branches. Each movement made the forest spin around me. I repeated the same thought to myself whenever the urge to lie down became overwhelming. Just a little longer, for Kaka. I carried the berries back, pushed them into my mouth, and swallowed without tasting them. The food gave me just enough strength to crawl beside Kaka before exhaustion dragged me into sleep once more. When I awoke again, dawn had reached the cave. The storm had passed, leaving drops of water clinging to the roots and a pale light spreading across the moss. Judging by the stiffness in my body and the emptiness in my stomach, at least a full day had gone by. I hurried to Kaka and shook him. He remained unresponsive, but after several terrifying seconds, I saw the faint rise and fall of his chest. The thread of life had not broken. With that fear temporarily eased, I examined our shelter more carefully. Near the entrance, water had collected in a shallow depression among the roots. It was clear and cool, filtered through soil and wood rather than standing openly in the forest. I drank from it until the dryness left my throat, then carried a little to Kaka and moistened his lips. The rest of the cave held no hidden treasure. It was barely large enough for 2 small goblins, a patch of moss, and the scattered stones Kaka had mistaken for hatchlings. Yet its cramped size also meant that many larger creatures could not easily enter. If I could improve the entrance and gather supplies, the hollow might protect us until Kaka recovered. Before leaving, I embraced him and kissed his forehead. His skin remained cold, but his breathing continued. Outside, the morning light revealed the massive tree sheltering us. Apples hung from its upper branches, bright against the leaves. The sight filled me with excitement until I realized how far above the ground they were. To a human, the fruit might have been reachable with a jump or a short climb. To my hatchling body, the trunk rose like a tower. I stretched, searched for low branches, and even considered climbing the rough bark. None of it seemed possible. The difference between my memories as a human and the limits of my new body became painfully clear. I might understand what needed to be done and still lack the strength or size to do it. That frustration led me to the sticks and stones scattered across the forest floor. If my body was too weak, I needed tools. I selected a sturdy branch and used a pointed pebble to split one end. Into that opening, I wedged a smooth stone, then wrapped thin vines around both pieces until they held together. The result was an ugly hammer, but when I struck another rock with it, the force no longer passed directly into my hand. I used the hammer to fracture a second stone and expose a sharper edge. With repeated blows, I shaped it into a crude hatchet. Cutting a bush with such a tool still took hours because every stroke carried little weight, yet the blade eventually chewed through the stem. The fallen branches gave me long, straight pieces of wood that would have been impossible to break by hand. Among the stones, I found one unlike the rest, a glossy black chunk of obsidian with naturally sharp edges. I remembered that volcanic glass could be shaped into cutting tools. Working slowly, I struck away flakes until the stone resembled a small blade. The obsidian knife was rough and uneven, but its edge sliced through bark and plant fibers far more easily than any ordinary rock. Shaping it demanded much more care than making the hammer. Obsidian did not break in predictable chunks. A strike that was too heavy could shatter the entire piece, while a blow in the wrong place sent a sharp flake toward my face or hands. I learned to tap the stone at an angle, remove thin layers, and turn the piece after every few strikes. The final blade fit awkwardly in my grip, so I wrapped one end with strips of fiber. The rough handle prevented the glassy stone from sliding when wet. I tested the edge first on grass, then bark, and finally a thin vine. Each cut confirmed that the dangerous sharpness could become an advantage if controlled. The same principle guided the basket. My first woven base twisted into a useless knot. The second held its shape until I lifted it, then opened and dropped everything through the bottom. I studied the broken pattern, changed the direction of the crossing fibers, and tried again. Because my hands were small, I could weave tighter spaces than Kaka might have managed, though the work made my fingers cramp. I selected flexible strips for the walls and stronger vines for the rim. The shoulder straps required several layers, so they would not tear under weight. When the basket finally supported stones without collapsing, I walked around the apple tree with it on my back. The load shifted and nearly pulled me over, so I shortened one strap and reinforced the base. Only after those adjustments did the basket become truly useful. The barricade required another kind of reasoning. I could not build a wall large enough to resist a monster, but the cave entrance itself already limited how something could approach. I angled the stakes toward the only route a creature could use, placed the strongest points at head and chest height for a small predator, and left just enough room for Kaka and me to squeeze through. I collected additional stones to brace the stakes and hammered them into the earth until my arms went numb. Vines tied the upper sections together, so one broken stick would not immediately collapse the entire barrier. Standing behind it, I felt protected. Stepping outside and looking back, I could see how fragile it truly was. That contradiction stayed with me. The barricade was both inadequate and better than nothing. And survival often depended on accepting both truths at once. Holding it made me feel, for the first time since waking in this world, that I could change my surroundings instead of merely enduring them. I stripped thin shavings from the branches and wove them together with flexible vines. The first attempts collapsed, but I kept adjusting the pattern until the material formed a small basket. I added 2 straps so it could rest against my back, leaving both hands free. The basket transformed the way I could gather supplies. Instead of carrying only what fit in my arms, I could collect berries, mushrooms, herbs, moss, stones, and scraps of useful material during the same trip. My next concern was defense. Using the knife, I sharpened several sticks to narrow points. I drove them into the ground around the cave entrance and supported them with stones, then tied the separate pieces together with vines. The completed barricade looked formidable from my height. Deep down, I understood that a powerful predator could destroy it, but even a weak obstacle might slow an attacker or discourage a smaller animal. That possibility was enough. I returned to Kaka, checked his breathing, and applied another layer of herb paste before venturing farther. I kept the apple tree in sight at all times. The forest still frightened me, but each useful discovery pushed that fear aside. Berries and mushrooms filled the basket first. I gathered more medicinal plants, damp moss for cleaning wounds, and straight branches for future tools. Then, beneath a pile of decaying leaves, I noticed the remains of a deer. The animal had been dead for some time. Most of its flesh was gone, consumed by scavengers and insects, leaving bones wrapped in a weathered hide. The corpse was a warning that something capable of killing a deer lived nearby, but the pelt offered warmth we desperately needed. I approached only after checking the trees and undergrowth for movement. Using the obsidian knife, I began separating the hide from the remains. The work was unpleasant and slow. My arms tired quickly, and the blade repeatedly caught against dried tissue. I had to stop, rest, and continue. Hours passed before the pelt finally came free in one large piece. Rolling it into a bundle was easy compared with moving it. The hide weighed almost as much as I did. I dragged it over roots and stones, slipping in the mud while the daylight faded around me. Several times, I considered leaving part of it behind, but thoughts of Kaka shivering in the cave kept me moving. By the time I reached the apple tree, my hands were raw, and my legs barely supported me. Inside the cave, I cleaned the pelt as thoroughly as I could, and divided it into 2 pieces. The larger section became a blanket wide enough to cover both of us. I stretched the smaller section across the entrance and pinned it to the surrounding roots with sharpened splinters. The hide blocked much of the wind, reduced the rain blowing inside, and concealed our movements from anything passing outside. Closing the entrance also left the cave almost completely dark. Among the mushrooms I had gathered were several that emitted a faint glow. I pressed them into patches of damp moss along the walls. Their soft light was not bright, but it allowed me to see Kaka, the supplies, and the entrance, without exposing a flame or smoke. The hollow beneath the apple tree began to resemble a shelter rather than a grave. I organized the interior as carefully as the limited space allowed. Food stayed in the driest corner, elevated on broad leaves so it would not absorb moisture from the ground. Herbs were separated by appearance and smell, because confusing a healing plant with an unknown one could be fatal. Stones and bones formed a pile near the entrance, while cutting tools remained beside the wall where I would not step on them in the dark. The glow mushrooms required dampness to remain bright. I pressed their bases into living moss and sprinkled them with water from the pool. Their light pulsed faintly, creating overlapping circles across the roots. It was enough to reveal movement without shining beyond the pelt at the entrance. The deer hide still carried traces of the forest and the dead animal. I scraped away what remained on the inner surface, washed it in sections, and rubbed it with crushed leaves to reduce the odor. The work did not make it clean by human standards, but it made the pelts safer to use and less likely to attract scavengers. I also learned that every improvement created a new concern. Blocking the entrance preserved warmth but reduced fresh air. The pelt gave comfort but carried scent. Storing food protected us from hunger but could invite insects and animals. Even the glow mushrooms might reveal us if the covering shifted. For that reason, I checked the entrance repeatedly and kept the brightest mushrooms toward the rear. I buried berry stems and spoiled pieces outside, away from the tree, though I did not yet understand how far scent could travel. Between tasks, I returned to Kaka. I counted his breaths, touched his skin, and adjusted the blanket. Sometimes his face tightened in pain. Sometimes he whispered unintelligible sounds that might have been names. Whenever he reached for absent hatchlings, I placed one of the pebbles back into his hand. The cave changed because I needed it to support his recovery. Without Kaka, I might have curled into the moss and waited for fate. Caring for him forced me to think about water, warmth, light, medicine, storage, tools, and defense. Each necessity pulled another fragment of Shota's forgotten knowledge into use. When I examined Kaka again, I found the first clear signs of regeneration. The stitched wound on his head had begun to close. Swollen tissue had fused around the silk, forming a thick scar. Other injuries remained severe, including burns left by Slasher's torch during our escape. But even those areas showed fragile new skin beneath the damaged surface. The process was disturbing to witness. Goblin healing did not restore the body cleanly or painlessly. Dead tissue loosened, while raw new growth formed underneath. Still, the change meant the berries, water, and herbs had given his body enough fuel to continue. I cleaned the wounds with damp moss, replaced the medicinal paste, and wrapped Kaka in the pelt. Then I crawled beneath it and pressed myself against his side to share what little warmth I had. Throughout the night, his breathing weakened and strengthened in uneven cycles. Whenever it became too faint, I held him closer and sang the lullaby we had once used for the hatchlings at the breeding farm. The song carried memories of a place I hated, but also of the moments when Kaka had tried to create comfort inside it. By morning, 2 full days had passed since he collapsed. I woke disoriented, then remembered where I was, and hurried to his side. "Kaka, wake up," I said while shaking him. "A new day has come. You have slept long enough. Please open your eyes." He remained still. Panic tightened around my chest. I called louder and shook him again. For a moment, I believed his body had finally given up. Then Kaka moaned. His legs kicked weakly, and his body twisted onto one side. A violent release followed, filling the cave with a terrible smell and splattering waste across the wall and ground. Bloody urine came afterward, adding to the mess. The sight and stench made my eyes water, but relief overwhelmed disgust. His body was processing food and expelling waste. The systems inside him were beginning to function again. I cleaned the cave, then washed Kaka with water from the pool. As mud and damaged tissue came away, fresh patches of sensitive skin appeared underneath. The burned areas around his lower body had also begun regenerating. Even structures that had been badly damaged were slowly reforming as small, undeveloped growths. It was gruesome, but it was life. I reapplied the herbs, wrapped him in the blanket, and kissed his forehead before stepping outside. The forest seemed strangely quiet. After surviving several days without a direct attack, I began to believe Kaka's warnings might have been exaggerated. I had not seen the monsters he feared. Food and useful materials were everywhere. The cave remained hidden, and my barricade stood intact. What I did not know was that creatures from across the forest had gathered at the ruins of the breeding farm. The adventurers had left behind a field of goblin corpses, and predators had descended upon the remains. While I wandered beneath the trees, convinced the area was peaceful, the forest's most dangerous inhabitants were feeding only a short distance away. My ignorance felt like safety. I searched farther from the apple tree and discovered a rusted tin can. Though empty and corroded, it could hold water or dry food. I also found a torn strip of fabric that might serve as a bandage. Several animal bones, twisted vines, useful stones, mushrooms swollen by rain, edible-looking roots, nuts, and more berries. Every discarded object became valuable because we possessed so little. While pushing through a thicket, I suddenly found myself at the edge of a cliff. The drop was only several meters, but to my tiny body it looked like a bottomless abyss. I stumbled backward and landed hard, clutching my chest while my heart hammered. The discovery frightened me, yet I remembered the location. Dangerous terrain could also become useful if I understood it. Before leaving, I studied the ground around the ridge. Thick roots protruded from the soil near the edge. Bushes concealed the drop from anyone approaching quickly, and loose stones covered part of the slope. I did not imagine using the cliff against a predator, but I recognized that knowing where it lay could keep me from wandering over it by accident. On the return journey, the objects in my basket knocked against one another with every step. The rusted can was dented, but still held a little water. The cloth smelled of damp earth and age, yet after washing it, I could use it to wrap tools or clean wounds. Several bones were straight enough to become needles, handles, or points. Roots and tubers promised more substantial food than berries if they proved safe. The sky darkened faster than I expected. Wind moved through the canopy in waves, turning the leaves pale as their undersides flipped upward. Birds disappeared. The temperature dropped, and the first scattered drops became steady rain. I hurried, frightened that darkness would hide the apple tree before I found it. The landmarks I had unconsciously noticed: the split trunk, a patch of pale stones, a bent shrub guided me back. Only later would Kaka teach me to use such signs deliberately. Inside the cave, the storm amplified every weakness of our shelter. Water seeped around the edges of the pelt. Wind pressed it inward and made the splinters holding it creak. The roots above groaned as the tree moved. When the howl came, it did not sound like wind. It rose from somewhere beyond the nearest trees and stretched through the rain with deliberate force. The second howl seemed closer. I watched through a narrow gap until lightning illuminated the forest. For one instant, I thought I saw eyes between the bushes. The next flash revealed only leaves. My mind shifted between certainty and doubt, unable to decide whether danger was truly present. Returning to Kaka did not erase the fear. I kept listening from beneath the pelt, counting the time between thunder and searching for another howl. Sleep came only in short fragments, interrupted whenever a branch scraped the roots or debris struck the entrance. Morning did not prove that my fear had been foolish. It proved only that whatever moved outside had chosen not to enter. Dark clouds gathered as I returned to the cave. Rain began before I reached the entrance, and a cold wind moved through the trees. I slipped inside just as the storm strengthened. Kaka remained unconscious. I tucked the pelt around him, then froze when a distant howl rose above the wind. I crawled to the entrance and lifted one corner of the hide. Lightning revealed the forest in brief white flashes. Trees bent beneath the storm, leaves flew through the air, and movement flickered inside the undergrowth. Another howl followed, long and low. Something was out there. I watched until fear made every branch resemble a claw and every shadow resemble an animal. Eventually, I convinced myself that the storm was playing tricks on my senses. I lowered the covering and returned to Kaka. The rain continued through the night. I pressed close beneath the blanket, drawing comfort from the warmth of his body and the sound of his breathing. At dawn, the cold inspired another invention. Scraps remained from cutting the deer hide, so I selected the largest pieces and stitched them together with leftover spider silk. The work required patience, and the makeshift needle pricked my fingers more than once. At last, I fashioned a simple loincloth that wrapped around my hips and protected some of my skin from the chill. I had just finished adjusting it when Kaka grunted. His arms and legs stretched weakly. He rubbed at eyes sealed by dried tears and slowly forced them open. Consciousness returned in stages. Confusion first, then pain, then fear. Joy overwhelmed me. I jumped, struck my head against the low ceiling, and tumbled onto the moss. Ignoring the ache, I rushed back to him. "Kaka, you're awake," I cried. He blinked around the cave, unable to recognize it at first. "What happened? Where are we?" he asked, his voice rough from days without speech. I told him he had been unconscious for days, and that we were hidden beneath an apple tree. I explained that I had treated his head, fed him, and stayed beside him through the storms. Kaka tried to sit. Pain forced him to stop, but a sudden fear sharpened his expression. "We must leave. Little Hermit," he said through a cough. "This place is not safe." I argued that nothing had harmed us in 3 days. The cave had water, food nearby, and protection from the weather. For the first time in our lives, no overseer controlled us. I imagined remaining there forever, just the two of us. Free from the breeding farms and the evil goblins who had tormented us. "We could be happy here, Kaka," I said. "We could leave the pain behind and make this our home." His eyes filled with sadness. "The forest is never safe," he warned. "Creatures will find us eventually. We cannot hide forever. We must keep searching for somewhere we can truly be free." The effort of speaking exhausted him. His eyes closed, and he slipped back into sleep. I fed him, gave him water, and waited until his breathing became steady. Then restlessness drove me outside again, rather than sit helplessly. I returned to the deer remains to collect bones for tools. That was when the forest finally showed me the truth Kaka had tried to explain. While sorting through the scattered bones, I felt the uneasy sensation of being watched. Every rustle made me glance over my shoulder. At first, I found nothing except wet leaves and dark trunks. Then, 2 glowing eyes appeared inside the undergrowth. A wolf stepped into view. Its fur was nearly black, its claws dug into the soft earth, and blood stained the teeth exposed by its growl. The creature moved without hesitation, already certain that the small goblin before it was prey. When it lunged, I ran. My legs pumped as fast as they could through the dense vegetation. The wolf was faster in open ground, but my small body slipped beneath branches and through gaps that forced it to slow or crash aside. Its breath reached my heels. Each snap of its jaws sounded close enough to end the chase. Roots, stones, and fallen wood turned the forest floor into an obstacle course. I stumbled more than once and recovered only because fear refused to let me fall. The wolf followed relentlessly, tearing through shrubs while I searched for any path narrow enough to save me. Then I burst through a thicket and reached the cliff I had discovered earlier. The drop opened directly before me. The wolf was only moments behind. I had no time to turn, so I threw myself over the edge and caught a thick root protruding from the earth. My body swung above the drop. The wolf followed too quickly to stop. It reached the ridge expecting me to continue running and lost its footing. For an instant, its snarling face appeared above mine. Then the animal plunged past me and struck the ground below with a heavy thud. I clung to the root until my hands began slipping. Pulling myself upward demanded every remaining part of my strength. Dirt broke away beneath my fingers, but I finally rolled onto solid ground. For several minutes, I could only lie there and breathe. When the shaking eased enough for me to move, I crawled to the edge and looked down. The wolf remained motionless at the bottom, its body broken by the fall. I had survived, but I did not feel victorious. The cliff, the root, and the animal's recklessness had saved me. A different path, or a single mistake, would have ended my life. The quiet after the chase felt more threatening than the noise. Other predators might hear the fall, or smell the fresh corpse. I abandoned the bones and hurried back toward the apple tree. Inside the cave, I collapsed beside Kaka and pressed against him until my breathing slowed. His presence, even unconscious, made the terror easier to endure. Not long afterward, he woke again with a long, painful yawn. His awareness returned more clearly this time. He looked at me, then around the cave, and asked how long he had been unconscious. 3 days and nights, and a little more, I answered. You woke this morning, but you fell asleep again. Kaka struggled into a sitting position. Every movement made him wince. My whole body is full of ouchies, he muttered. That adventurer clobbered my noggin badly. I did not think Kaka would live. He touched the scar and seemed surprised to find his skull whole. When he asked whether I had nursed him back to life, I nodded eagerly and explained that I had pushed the bones into place, stitched the torn skin, applied herbs, and fed him while he slept. No brain leaking out, I said with pride and relief. Kaka lives. A tired smile spread across his face. You saved Kaka's life, little Hermit. You are a good gobby, a smart and amazing gobby. Kaka is proud of you. Those words struck deeper than any praise I remembered receiving as Shota. I had not saved him for recognition, yet hearing that he was proud made every painful hour feel worthwhile. Once Kaka had enough strength to look around, curiosity drew his attention to everything filling the cave. When he had collapsed, the chamber had contained only moss and pebbles. Now it held a basket, tools, piles of food, medicinal plants, a water container, glow mushrooms, and the deer pelt. He picked up the stone hammer and turned it over in his hands. This looks like something a human would use, he said. Kaka has never seen such a thing made by a hatchling. I explained how the stone head concentrated the force of a strike and allowed me to shape other materials. He tested its weight cautiously, then moved on to the food. The smell of berries and mushrooms made his stomach growl. He exclaimed over the amount I had gathered and immediately ate several pieces. His relief at seeing food made me realize how deeply the farm had trained us to expect hunger. Kaka next examined my loincloth and the pelt. He pinched the stitching between 2 fingers and turned the fabric over, clearly surprised that spider silk could hold the scraps together. The garment was uneven, with one side longer than the other, yet Kaka treated it as though I had produced ceremonial clothing. He laughed about a time he had tried to make himself a hat from a cabbage leaf. The leaf had collapsed around his face during rain, but it had kept his head dry for several minutes. The memory brought a rare warmth to his expression. When I described dragging the deer hide home alone, that warmth disappeared. A dead animal is often a warning, he said. The thing that killed it may return. Scavengers may also follow the smell. You must look before touching what the forest offers. I admitted that I had checked the nearby trees, but had not considered how long scent could remain or how far it might travel. Kaka did not scold me harshly. He understood that the pelt had probably kept him alive through the cold nights. Instead, he repeated that useful things and dangerous things were often the same object, viewed from different sides. The basket fascinated him because it solved a problem he had accepted throughout his life. Goblins at the farm carried supplies in their arms, in torn cloth, or by dragging them. A container worn on the back meant more food could be gathered with less effort. He placed several berries inside, adjusted the straps, and attempted to wear it. The basket sat too high on his larger back and pulled against his wounds, so he quickly removed it, but the demonstration made him grin. You made a second pair of arms, he declared. Not real arms, but carrying arms. Very clever. His reaction to the knife was more dramatic because he had no understanding of an edge shaped that sharply. After cutting his finger, he glared at the obsidian as if expecting it to leap toward him. I showed him the wrapped handle and demonstrated how to keep his fingers behind the blade. I cut a berry in half, sliced a vine, and shaved a strip from a branch. Kaka watched each motion with growing respect. So it only bites where you tell it, he concluded. I answered that it would also bite carelessly, which was why we had to treat it with caution. Kaka nodded solemnly and repeated the rule aloud, as if teaching himself, hold the dull part, point the sharp part away, and never test it with a finger again. When I told him I had found the deer remains, removed the hide, and divided it into a blanket and entrance cover. His expression shifted from admiration to concern. "You have been very busy, little hermit," he said. "But the forest is dangerous. No wandering too far from the cave." Then he noticed the basket. He traced the woven pattern with his fingers and inspected the straps. I proudly demonstrated how it rested against my back and allowed me to carry supplies while keeping both hands free. "A fine basket," Kaka said. "Good for berries, mushrooms, stones, and all manner of useful things. You have a talent for making, little one." His praise made me puff out my chest. The obsidian knife produced a different reaction. Kaka lifted the black blade, sniffed it, and ran one finger along the edge. The stone cut him immediately. He yelped, dropped it, and kicked dirt over the blade as though it were a living creature. "Bad knife. It bites Kaka like a snake." I hurried to explain that the sharp edge was the reason it could cut branches, hide, and vines. The tool had not attacked him. He had touched the dangerous part. Kaka stared suspiciously at the knife, prodded it once, then picked it up with more care. "Maybe the knife is not entirely bad," he admitted. "Maybe it can cut berries or help build shelter. Kaka will be brave and use it for good, but you should make more nice things and fewer things that bite." Despite the seriousness of our situation, I could not stop myself from laughing. After inspecting the remaining tools, Kaka nodded with satisfaction. They were crude, but they gave us possibilities that bare hands did not. He said the hammer, knife, basket, and stored food could help us survive in the forest, provided we remained cautious. Kaka then rose, joints creaking, and moved toward the entrance. The daylight beyond the pelt made him squint. When he pushed outside and saw the sharpened barricade, his eyes widened. He approached it, touched one point, and immediately pricked his finger. Ouch! It pokes Kaka too. Once I explained the purpose, he praised the idea. The stakes might keep smaller predators away, and could slow a larger one long enough for us to hide. Outside the cave, he examined the piles of branches, leaves, stones, and bones I had gathered. While searching through the rocks, he found a jagged piece of flint. The discovery excited him more than any of my tools. "A spark stone," he cried. "Goblins use this to make fire. One good spark, and we can have warmth on cold nights." He tucked the flint carefully into his loincloth as though it were treasure. I praised his knowledge, and for a moment we simply stood together beneath the apple tree, each of us possessing skills the other lacked. Then Kaka looked upward. The apples hanging above us transformed his expression. He recognized them as rush apples, a rare delicacy among goblins. When ripe, the fruit produced a powerful, intoxicating pleasure. The cruel goblins who controlled breeding farms prized them and guarded their supplies greedily. "They are not ready yet," Kaka said, almost trembling with excitement. "But soon they will ripen. This tree is a treasure beyond measure." His joy ended when he sniffed the air. Kaka turned toward me, nostrils twitching. His gaze dropped to the scrapes, covering my knees and elbows. "You smell like wet dog, but worse," he said. "What happened to you? Did something hurt my little hermit?" I told him about the wolf. As I described the glowing eyes, blood-stained teeth, chase through the undergrowth, and fall from the cliff, Kaka's face tightened with fear. I tried to reassure him by explaining that the wolf was dead and could no longer trouble us. Kaka was not reassured. "Wolves hunt in packs," he warned. "If one found you, others may be close. Even grown goblins struggle against such beasts, and you are only a hatchling. They would eat the flesh from your bones." He ordered me back toward the cave. I agreed immediately, shaken by the possibility that the dead wolf had not been alone. We had almost reached the entrance when the tall grass exploded on both sides. 2 wolves charged at us. Kaka screamed for me to run. We bolted toward the cave, our short legs moving with desperate speed. I threw myself through the narrow opening first, scraping my skin against the roots. Kaka squeezed in behind me as jaws snapped at his heels. The first wolf lunged directly into the barricade. The structure bent and cracked beneath its weight, but several sharpened stakes struck the animal. It howled and thrashed, scattering stones and breaking vines. Blood darkened its fur before it tore free and fled into the forest. My feeble defense had not stopped the attack completely, but it had injured one predator and forced it away. The second wolf circled the entrance. It tore through what remained of the barricade and shoved its head into the opening. Its shoulders were too broad to follow, yet its jaws reached far enough that Kaka and I pressed ourselves against the rear wall. The animal snapped repeatedly, barking and snarling as it tried to force more of its body through the roots. Kaka grabbed the flint. He struck it against another stone. Sparks showered across the wolf's face. The creature jerked backward, surprised by the sudden light and heat. Kaka struck again, producing a brighter burst that singed its fur. The wolf yelped, stumbled away from the entrance, and collided with a tree. Disoriented and frightened, it fled after its wounded companion. For several seconds, the only sounds inside the cave were our breathing and the final crackle of dying sparks. The barricade lay destroyed. The pelt covering had been torn aside, and claw marks scored the earth around the opening. We had survived, but the attack had proven that the wolves could find us and were willing to force their way inside. Kaka slumped against the wall. "Too close," he said. "Those creatures are clever. They watch from shadows and wait until prey is careless. If we had been farther from the cave, we would be scraps by now." Fear that I had suppressed during the attack finally escaped. "What do we do when they return?" I asked. "If the forest is this dangerous, where can we go? Are we doomed to hide until something stronger finds us?" Kaka pulled me into his arms. His body was still weak, yet his embrace felt steady. He kissed my forehead and promised that he would do everything he could to protect me. "Do not lose hope, little hermit," he murmured. "Even in darkness, there may be a small path forward. Kaka is here, and Kaka loves you." Once my trembling eased, he explained the choices before us. The first was to find another goblin breeding farm. Kaka had lived long enough to know that not every farm was as vicious as the one we escaped. Some masters provided enough food to keep their slaves healthy and did not torture them without reason. Life there would still mean labor and submission, but perhaps it would be bearable. The suggestion filled me with horror. Memories of the overseers, cages, punishments, and dead hatchlings returned at once. "No farms, Kaka," I begged. "I do not want more pain. Please do not take me back." He placed a hand on my shoulder and assured me it was only one possible path, not the future he wanted. The second option was to leave the deepest forest and search for the open plains. Predators were fewer there. If we found a suitable cliff or hill, we might carve out another shelter and grow crops. Instead of relying entirely on scavenging, Kaka imagined a small field of berries, roots, and potatoes beneath open sunlight. The idea offered freedom, but the journey would be dangerous. Humans sometimes crossed the plains, and many killed goblins without asking whether they were warriors or slaves. We did not know the route, and the forest between us and open land was filled with hunters. I admitted that the thought of leaving terrified me. The breeding farm had been the only world I knew. We were not warriors, only two injured former slaves. Kaka acknowledged the fear, but reminded me that remaining in the cave guaranteed another attack. We had already survived horrors that would have broken stronger goblins. The plains offered only a tiny chance. Yet a tiny chance was still more than waiting to be eaten. I told him I trusted him. Even if my knees shook and every part of me wanted to hide, I would follow if he believed we could make it. Kaka's embrace tightened. The plains had once been his dream for all the hatchlings. He had imagined taking them away from the farms and building a settlement where they could grow without torture. Speaking of that, Future reminded him that every hatchling except me was gone. His voice failed. Silent sobs shook his body, and tears gathered in his eyes. I remained against his chest until he could speak again. Then Kaka offered a third possibility. Other races lived beyond the lands dominated by evil goblins. Cat people, lizardmen, and dog people did not automatically consider goblin slaves enemies. Some settlements might offer work, shelter, or at least mercy. Kaka had heard stories of such communities hidden throughout the region. I worried that they might reject us, betray us, or return us to our former masters. Kaka did not deny the risk. Finding them would depend on luck, and kindness was never guaranteed. Still, that path offered the possibility of freedom without trying to survive entirely alone. There was no safe choice. Kaka explained each path without hiding its cruelty. A gentler breeding farm might keep us alive, but survival there would belong to someone else. We could be separated, sold, punished, or forced to raise another generation of hatchlings. For masters who saw them as property, even a farm considered bearable by Goblin standards would never be freedom. The plains offered open sky and fewer places for predators to hide, but also fewer places for us to hide from humans. Food might be easier to cultivate once we established ourselves, yet reaching that stage required tools, seeds, shelter, and enough strength to defend a field. We possessed almost none of those things. Seeking other races depended on uncertain stories Kaka had heard about settlements hidden beyond the territory of the evil goblins. He could not promise that the cat people, lizardmen, or dog people would welcome us, but he believed they might judge 2 former slaves with more mercy than our own masters ever had. That possibility was fragile, yet it gave us another direction to consider once Kaka had recovered enough to travel. Returning to goblins risked slavery. Searching for the plains risked predators and humans. Seeking another race risked rejection or betrayal. Staying beneath the apple tree meant waiting for the wolves or something worse. I finally nodded and asked only that we move carefully. Kaka kissed my forehead. "I will think through the night," he promised. "We will find a path and make a future of our own." For the moment, however, we needed to survive until morning. The destroyed barricade could not protect us again. Kaka proposed covering the entrance with a door made from branches and vines. We gathered the straightest sticks we could find, without traveling far, and carried them into the cave. Our materials were poor. The branches bent in different directions, and the vines were rough, brittle, and difficult to knot. Kaka's hands moved with the efficiency of long practice, while mine repeatedly tangled the fibers or tied pieces too loosely. Together, we formed a lattice large enough to cover the opening. It leaned crookedly and creaked whenever we moved it. We attached it to the roots with vine loops that served as makeshift hinges, then wedged a thick branch across the inside as a locking bar. The finished door would not stop a determined monster. Still, it hid the entrance, blocked some of our scent, and would make enough noise to warn us if something tried to enter. When we lowered it into place, darkness filled the cave. The glow mushrooms cast a dim blue-green light across the walls, the tools, the stored food, and Kaka's healing scars. For the first time since waking, Kaka allowed himself to sit without staring at the forest. Then he beckoned me closer. "Time for lessons, little hermit," he said. "There is much you must learn before you mature, and your mind grows slower." I shuffled over and sat before him, eager to understand whatever knowledge had kept him alive through so many years of slavery and hardship. Kaka began with the forest itself. "This place can shelter us," he explained, "but it can also swallow us. If you lose your path beneath these trees, you may wander until hunger, monsters, or the cold take you. So the first thing a goblin must learn is how to find the way." To me, the surrounding wilderness had always looked like an endless collection of identical trunks and shadows. Kaka showed me that the forest was filled with signs, provided I learned to notice them. He drew rough shapes in the dirt with one finger. Rocks, he said, could act as silent markers. A lone boulder beside a trail, a line of smaller stones, or a distinctive formation could reveal where we had been and help us recognize a route later. Natural clearings and exposed roots could serve the same purpose. Low-hanging vines often indicated damp ground or nearby water. They were not an absolute promise, but when combined with the sound of a stream or changes in the plants, they could guide a thirsty traveler. Kaka then scratched the shape of a tree trunk into the soil. "When you are lost, look at the moss," he said. "It often grows thicker on one side. That can help you choose a direction. But do not trust one sign alone. The forest changes after storms, and what is true in one place may deceive you in another." He wanted me to compare everything around me, instead of seizing the first clue. The position of moss, the slope of the land, the direction of flowing water, and familiar rock formations together offered a better answer than any one of them separately. Next, he told me to listen. The forest had a language of its own. Leaves rustling against the wind sounded different from branches disturbed by an animal. Bird calls could reveal whether the area was calm, while sudden silence might warn that a predator had approached. The distant babble of water could guide us toward a stream. Heavy movement through brush might belong to something too large. for us to confront. Kaka made me close my eyes and identify the sounds inside and beyond the cave. I heard the wind rubbing branches against the roots, water dripping near the entrance, and tiny insects moving beneath the moss. Once I concentrated, the silence no longer felt empty. It contained layers I had previously ignored. Your eyes cannot see through every bush, Kaka told me. Your ears may warn you before danger steps into view. Finally, he spoke about instinct. Every living creature possessed some natural sense of direction and danger. Fear was not always cowardice. Sometimes the tightening of the body, the feeling of being watched, or the sudden urge to stop was the mind noticing something before conscious thought could explain it. Trust that feeling, Kaka said, but do not let fear rule every step. Use it together with what you see and hear. The lesson forced me to reconsider my recent mistakes. When the forest had gone quiet, I had assumed nothing dangerous was nearby. Kaka explained that prey animals often became silent because a predator was present. What I had mistaken for peace might have been a warning. Under his guidance, I practiced reading the rough map he drew across the cave floor. He marked an imaginary stream, several large rocks, a patch of vines, and a group of trees. Then he asked me how I would travel from one point to another and still return. At first, I chose the most direct route. Kaka pointed out that it crossed open ground and passed too near a place where a predator might hide. He showed me how a slightly longer path could follow cover, remain close to water, and use recognizable landmarks. We repeated the exercise until I stopped thinking only about distance and began considering safety. The lesson did not turn me into an expert. Still, it gave structure to a world that had previously seemed random. The trees were no longer merely obstacles. Rocks, moss, vines, water, birds, wind, and scent could all become information. Kaka's patience surprised me. He never mocked a wrong answer. Whenever I misunderstood, he changed the drawing or explained the idea another way. At the breeding farm, knowledge had usually been used to control weaker goblins. Kaka used it to make me less helpless. Once he believed I understood the basics of navigation, he reached for the flint. Now we learn fire. He gathered a small bundle of dried leaves and thin twigs from the supplies stored inside the cave. The storms had soaked most material outside, but these pieces had remained protected beneath the pelt. He arranged them loosely so air could move between them. Kaka held up the flint and called it a spark stone. Its hard, jagged edge could scrape against another rough stone and tear away tiny burning fragments. Those sparks were weak and brief, so they needed to land on something dry enough to catch. "Watch closely, little one," he instructed. He struck the flint against the stone. A shower of sparks flashed in the dim cave and vanished before touching the tinder. He adjusted his grip and tried again. This time, several bright points landed among the leaves, but they died almost immediately. Kaka did not become frustrated. He changed the angle, moved the flint closer, and struck with a fast scraping motion rather than a heavy blow. A glowing ember appeared inside the tinder. He bent forward and blew gently. Smoke curled through the leaves. The ember brightened, spread, and suddenly became a tiny flame. I gasped and reached toward it before Kaka pulled my hand back. To the human I had once been, fire should have been ordinary. In that cave, after days of rain, darkness, and cold, it looked like a miracle born from two stones. The flame cast warm light over Kaka's face and pushed the shadows toward the walls. "This is how goblins make fire," he said proudly. "It can warm us, give light, and frighten some beasts. But fire can also burn our shelter or fill the cave with smoke, so we must respect it." He extinguished the flame before it grew large enough to threaten the dry roots. Then he placed the flint in my hand. "Your turn." Excitement and nervousness made my fingers tremble. I copied the position of his hands and struck the stones together with all the strength my small body could produce. A few sparks appeared, too weak and too far from the tinder. I tried again. The flint slipped sideways. Another attempt produced nothing except a dull scraping sound. Kaka told me to slow down. Strength alone would not create the right spark. The sharp edge had to slide across the stone at the proper angle. He demonstrated the movement without lighting the tinder, then returned the flint to me. I struck again and again. Weak sparks flashed and disappeared. My wrist grew sore, and the muscles in my arm began to ache. Each failure felt less like a lesson, and more like proof that I could not do what Kaka expected. "Come on, little hermit," he encouraged. "Keep trying. You can do it." I tightened my grip and swung once more. The flint missed the stone and scraped across my finger. Pain shot through my hand. I cried out and dropped both pieces. A shallow cut opened across the skin, and tears immediately filled my eyes. The injury was minor compared with everything we had survived, but exhaustion, fear, and frustration had accumulated inside me for days. That small failure broke through what remained of my confidence. I cradled my hand and began to cry. "I'm sorry, Kaka," I said. "I can't do it. I'm only a clumsy, worthless hatchling." The words felt familiar. Shota had used the same belief whenever effort became painful. If he failed once, he treated that failure as proof that trying again was meaningless. Luceria's insults had taken root because a part of me still feared she was right. Kaka's expression softened. He drew me against his side and examined the cut. "No, Hermit," he said. "You are not worthless. You are learning. That is all. Fire making takes time and practice. How about giving it another try?"